Welcome to Political Business. On the podcast this week, the world changed as Keir Starmer navigates a war in the Middle East.
Labour lose a by-election, coming historic third in Gorton and Denton.
And the Oxford Street Development Corporation takes a step forward with their second board meeting and the planning chair announced. So let's start with the major week's events. Kevin, talk us through what has changed. You've just come back from the Middle East yourself, so you had a front row seat, unwillingly, to events in that part of the world. But talk us through what's going on.
Well, as a week seems like a long time ago, but of course, as we've all seen, the world has changed in the last few days as the US and Israel attacked Iran. We'll talk about the domestic implications for that. But as you say, I did happen to be in Oman in the Middle East over that period and got to see firsthand both the kind of reaction of people, but also local people and also Brits and other foreigners who were in Oman, and I was also in Saudi Arabia at the time. Very, very unsettling. Lots of people shaken on a personal level. It was interesting to say on that. I would say something that I noticed. Obviously, I was watching, what was happening in Parliament from Riyadh, where I was quite surprised by the performance of Ed Davey, doing a very cheap jab, I thought, at those who are stuck in Dubai. I think you can take or leave Dubai, and I think many people would leave it who listen to the podcast. But it's fair to say that this kind of influencer crowd that people are being quite mean about do form only a small proportion of those expats that live in the Middle East. And Britain has long-standing trade and defence relationships with the UAE. And I met quite a few professional kind of middle-aged families with kids who have made the journey from Dubai to Muscat and then on to Saudi Arabia because they wanted to take their family home and wanted to, concerned about their safety. And I think it became a bit cartoonish in some social media, laughing at these young influencers who perhaps didn't appreciate where they were in the world this week, never mind last week. But you have to remember that actually the families and others are caught in a war zone. I thought was highly inappropriate for the leader of the Liberal Democrats, and once again reminded me that Ed Davey was never and is never a serious politician. But anyway, that's my kind of short moral mission over. I have to say, as a Briton who was sat in Riyadh trying to get a flight back to the UK, I thought it was pretty unbecoming of a senior British politician. Anyway, I shall leave it at that. So we do hope there'll be peace in the Middle East, of course. Unfortunately, myself, whilst I made it back in one piece, thanks to our good friends at British Airways, my bag is somewhere in the Saudi Arabian desert, which is why my hair's a bit of a mess for those watching on YouTube. Anyway, so there we are. But what does it mean? What does it mean for Westminster? I think what's fascinating is actually Keir Starmer has taken a different position to the United States, has stuck to his position that this is an illegal action under international law by Donald Trump and the Israeli government, and has basically refused to really budge from that view. Of course, we have had the ongoing conversation about whether or not would you allow the US to use British bases. We didn't allow the US to use Diego Garcia or indeed RAF bases in the UK or RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus. As part of the initial attack, we have subsequently allowed the US to take certain offensive actions from RAF Akrotiri and other bases now that the conflict has started. But there's been quite a big backlash from the White House with Keir Starmer saying that so Donald Trump saying that Keir Starmer is no Winston Churchill, ironically to the German Chancellor in the Oval Office. I'm sure it was quite an awkward moment for him for many reasons, current and historical. But taking it back away from kind of CNN and to the hyper-parochial Westminster view, I think Keir Starmer has built up a lot of political capital with the PLP. Most people seem to support his position. Polling today will suggest the British public support Keir Starmer's position. He's been very explicit that he's cognizant of the lessons of Iraq and not being dragged into an American forever war. And quite frankly, anyone who's watched the press conference with Donald Trump or Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, War Secretary rather, does worry that there's any plan here beyond, destroying large parts of Iran. So I think this could be a reminder that Keir Starmer is actually quite effective on the foreign stage.
I think you're right, and I think he's handled it in a pretty measured way, potentially managing and balancing some domestic political pressures as well. I think it's in danger, though, of pleasing nobody, because the fact that he has the fact that the legal advice that he was relying on said, you can't use UK bases, can't use British bases initially. That position obviously then changed when it became a defensive operation, and the legal advice changed. And in classic Keir Starmer way, he talked that through in a very legal process, and you could tell that he was almost, that's how he considered it, and so he transparently spoke about that. I think you then get those people who think that we've now burnt a lot of capital of all of the time that he's spent building a good relationship with Donald Trump and a good relationship with the White House, being annoyed that, the Americans are now not very happy with us and that will have some consequence, and not stood up enough to say we're absolutely not getting involved in any way to please some of those people on the more left of the Labour Party who are saying don't get involved at all. So, I mean, look, I think there's no other way that he could have handled this. And I think, ultimately a considered position for a British Prime Minister in matters of foreign policy and defence is a good thing. I think the problem internationally is that Donald Trump doesn't care about these legal distinctions at all, does he? And, it all started with a piece in The Sun where he said he was very disappointed in Starmer, that interview, and then proceeded to riff in the Oval Office in, I think, what some are calling a Zelensky moment for Starmer, even though he wasn't even there, which may be a bit over the top.
I think that's hyperbole.
But, and this was after he launched into the Spanish. So, Donald Trump is on a kind of mission now to admonish those who are criticising him for this, which is an extraordinary thing for Trump, given his, a lot of his premiership was predicated on America first and not getting involved in these foreign wars. But domestic politics is definitely playing out here as well, right? The Green Party came out very quickly and said we should absolutely have zero involvement in this war. Britain should not be involved at all. Somewhat unrealistic position, given we're already involved by virtue of there being many Brits stranded in the Middle East, and also clearly when you've got the sort of military presence that we have in some of the neighbouring countries.
Not to mention the moral obligation historically.
Yeah, and a moral obligation historically, and not just historically, but now. You can't just shy away from these things. But clearly he's trying to manage, the politics from that flank of the party as well. And there was an interesting social media clip that I shared with you this morning, Kevin, which I just thought showed you maybe some of the thought process in number 10 at the moment. You can tell me whether this is true or not. But the clip was essentially Keir Starmer talking to a lot of European and regional leaders about the British involvement in what's happened so far. And very much the standout message from the clip is, as you know, we were not involved in the strikes at the weekend, really trying to frame it as we've been dragged into this and we're doing it in a very limited surgical way, so as to not really get dragged into what, many people consider the original sin of the Labour government over the last 2 decades is the Iraq War. So interesting times, as we say, Kevin, but how is this playing out domestically within Labour, coming off the back of quite a difficult election result for the Prime Minister and the Labour Party last week?
Yeah, I think there's definitely strong public levels of support for Keir Starmer's position on the conflict, and mostly privately positive as well. The PLP meeting on Monday, Keir started with stating the position, and got lots of support, and was seen as being very statesmanlike. There are some elements in the right of the party who think we should be going further, especially now that the British base has been attacked, and some made the point. Keir's taking a principal position. That is absolutely right, but there are 130,000 Brits registered in the Gulf, and we do actually have to protect them. And just an aside, there was direct lobbying from the Emirates and from Qatar to that effect, which is there are bombs falling down on Doha and Dubai, and your citizens are here. The French are getting more involved at that point than we were. So I think and also others are saying, look, history will take a long view on this. We are only a few days into this conflict, and I think in a week's time, our involvement might be entirely different. So I think it's seen as he's taking the right approach. Some disquiet, by the way, at the way the opposition's behaving, and particularly with the way they're behaving whilst they're abroad and dealing with foreign politicians on this subject, when the view is that the Labour Party in opposition backed the government at the time on issues of national security when we had British forces in conflict zones. So I think that's seen as being a bit cheap, particularly from the Conservatives. You might expect it from Reform, but you don't actually actively lobby against your own government's position when there are RAF Typhoons in the sky. That's not a serious politician. So I think there's some disquiet there.
I wonder where your own political bias is.
I think my view quite clear. But what's fascinating is, of course, is the main subject of conversation going into the PLP meeting 40 hours before would have been the by-election result just a couple of days before. And that was the second subject after Keir spoke to the PLP. So I've been very sombre and statesmanlike, then taking a bit of a hammering over the by-election result. And in particular, an action perhaps slightly organised by Lucy Powell, the deputy leader, who was in charge of the by-election defeat, to say that Labour was a mistake attacking the Greens and attacking the winning candidate. So that came out in a bit of criticism of the party organisation for the by-election. So there's still ongoing conversation there, and I think there's a real tension here about how Labour responds to coming third place to the Greens. The question that Sadiq Khan did a piece earlier this week saying that, you stop attacking the Greens, potentially we need to hug them. That's generally a view from some on the, in elements of the parliamentary and wider party. I think it's interesting when you say stop aping reform, and the answer to stop aping reform is to then potentially ape the Greens. I think we need to learn the lesson in all parties that you don't stop people voting for, parties to your left or your right, in the case of the Conservatives, by aping them, because if people want the full fat version, they'll vote for it. There still needs to be a case of the Labour Party making a case for a Labour government and Labour values, and that needs to be not triangulated against Reform and the Greens. It needs to actually be a position. You can be tough on borders and immigration. Lots of people have been saying publicly that Labour's position on immigration is what harmed it in the by-election, with particularly the Muslim vote. I think if anyone thinks that immigration control is not a doorstep issue across the country, then I don't know what world they're living in. You can be fair and tough with Labour values on migration whilst also having a view on tax take and macroeconomics, all the rest of it. So I think there's still a bit of a problem here that Labour risks. I think Paul Ovenden, who used to work at Number 10, did a piece of the Times this week saying that Labour risks drifting into sackcloth and ashes territory, which is basically a kind of very soft left, hand-wringing politics, when actually it needs to be muscular in government about what Labour government does. I think that is still an outstanding issue for the party. The party will feel good about itself that's not going into a conflict this week. But of course, in 7 days' time, if the need demands that British armed forces are much more involved, then that'll again be problematic.
I think also there's an artificial distinction about, do you follow Reform or do you follow the Green Party? It's quite interesting when you look at the voter profile of some of the people voting for these two parties. Very often they are just very anti the mainstream political parties, and there's quite a lot of crossover, at least in terms of attitude and a thought process. It's not like, one group is totally pro-immigration and another group is totally against immigration. It's more about style and substance. And if you look at the Green Party candidate in Gorton and Denton, he came across as a very ordinary person talking about ordinary issues, which I think was always the concern about selecting somebody like Matt Goodwin on the Reform side, is that he looks totally at odds to that. She was talking about, normal issues that people were talking about on a day-to-day basis. There was some stuff raked up about her previously saying, well, parts of the constituency are not that great. There's vape shops everywhere, all the rest of it. And, people were saying, well, look, she's talking the area down. Well, actually, she's just talking like a normal person. I think she comes across as a normal person and talking about normal issues. And ultimately, we can probably get a bit too sidetracked saying, well, if you're a Green Party supporter, you suddenly agree wholesale with everything that is on the Green Party agenda. Similarly, on the Reform agenda, there's quite a lot of crossover between these two parties in terms of sentiment. And I think anybody rushing, any mainstream, any of the two traditional political parties thinking about, a knee-jerk reaction to some of these issues is not going to deliver the sensible analysis that we need, which is why I suspect that we'll end up with, further discussion about this, then another set of data points coming in May, and that will then probably trigger this real conversation about the future direction of the Labour Party and indeed Keir Starmer himself.
Yeah, I think lots of Labour MPs said, I think Wes Streeting said this on the record, that when Hannah Spencer's talked about, people are working hard, they're doing what they're supposed to do, and yet they still can't, struggling to make ends meet. So that sounds like a Labour MP. So this is like a Labour person talking, but even more fundamentally than that, it's an ordinary person talking, which could be left or right, which is, the reality in this country is standard of living is not shifted. People work people run to stand still basically. And these are the two major parties aren't really answering the question in a fundamental way, and Reform and the Greens are answering it in a piecemeal way. I don't think anyone believes that we could, if we close the borders or if we tax, wealth at 80% at either extreme, that's going to solve the problem either. But I do think it gives everyone pause for thought. It's true, of course, it's got the Greens tail up.
Yeah.
And that's particularly relevant as we'll come on to talk into a bit in London, where the Greens are in contention. But before we do so, yesterday we had quite a significant event, or should have been a significant event, which was briefed by the Treasury as not being significant, which was the spring statement. Officially not a fiscal moment, as it had been under the last Conservative government, when there were two fiscal events a year, i.e. events where you might review spending and tax. This was an update, basically. But even for an update, it was already out of date the moment Rachel Reeves stood up in the chamber, because obviously the situation in the Middle East means that the markets are shifting quite dramatically. The gas price has shifted, the oil price has shifted, and we don't yet know what the long-term or short, medium-term economic impacts are going to be. The OBR scored the autumn statement, I think, 10 days ago. So it means that actually yesterday's numbers are pretty historic, which argues a shame, because what Rachel Reeves wanted to stand up and say was just the economy is it's beginning to move in a bit. There's a bit more on the everything's rather on track and going to plan. The OBR then said in their analysis afterwards that they downgraded growth and basically things are still pretty tough. So
downgraded this year, upgraded for future years, which I think was the narrative the Chancellor wanted to say, which is, inflation's coming down, things are, interest rates are going down.
And the trajectory to go down, and let's see what happens.
Shame about unemployment rising, of course, and youth unemployment being at 16%. But I think you can see how they wanted to frame the narrative around an improving situation. But as you say, completely out of date from the moment she stood up, completely out of date, as you say, 10 days ago when the OBR did their analysis. I think it was interesting that she referred to her second May's lecture quite a lot throughout the statement. And for those of you who don't know, this is a big annual lecture that the Chancellor traditionally gives, which sort of sets out economic objectives, is one of the moments outside of the budget and spring statement where you can talk to the audience you want to talk to about the fiscal and financial policy direction of your government. And she did say that she would then look to focus that statement on growth, youth unemployment, economic inactivity, that kind of thing. You do wonder how much that speech is now being reframed around events in the Middle East. It just shows you that. It reminds me of when Rishi Sunak stood up in February 2020 and delivered a budget, and then COVID hit a month later, and everything he said was completely out of date. And so I think, you've got all of these different factors playing out at the moment. Very difficult for the government to navigate it. Does give Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves a moment, though, to show that they are the grown-ups in the room, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, navigating us through very tricky waters.
Absolutely. So basically, let's see how the next few days pan out in order to have any kind of idea about how the economy might play out over the next 1, 2, 3 years. We talked about the by-election. We've talked about events in the Middle East. We said, of course, that one of the consequences of the by-election is that the Greens' tails are up. They've got a couple of targets in London, and all the kind of feedback from Green activists that I've spoken to and people in the Green leadership is that donations are up. It's all very exciting as we go into the May elections. One place in London where there won't be any elections because there's a specially established mayoral development corporation, did you like the segue there, Nathan?
I thought it was very good.
Oxford Street. And there's quite a significant moment last week in the delivery of the new Oxford Street Development Corporation. Nathan, do you want to talk us through what that was and what it means?
Yeah, indeed. A quick recap for those who haven't been following this in tons of detail. The Mayor of London and then Secretary of State Angela Rayner announced that Oxford Street and part of the West End would have a newly designated development corporation that would basically take in all of the functions of its planning management, street management, and allow the mayor to pursue his long-held aim to fully pedestrianise Oxford Street in the coming years. Now, there's been lots of chatter in the past about pedestrianisation, and it's always fallen down because it's in the middle of Westminster City Council, in the middle of a marginal ward within Westminster City Council. The Conservatives and the Labour Party have made commitments over the years to not fully pedestrianise it, and local residents in the area really don't want to see it happen. Nonetheless, what the mayor's done is said, look, fine, we'll take that out of any local decision making, create this Oxford Street Development Corporation. And this is now in effect as of the 1st of January this year. The Oxford Street Development Corporation came online. It has its own team, its own chief executive, its own chair, its own board, and is making decisions on the future of that area. What happened last Friday, was the second board meeting of this corporation got together, and they announced that the next planning chair, which will be of particular relevance to our audience, is Westminster will no longer be responsible for planning decisions. The next planning chair will be Dr. Margaret Casely-Hayford, who's a former Denton's partner, planning lawyer. I think she's been former director of legal services at John Lewis, involved in many cultural chairmanships over the years. And she will be taking on this role of leading planning and regeneration for the nation's high street. Now, this is all playing out against the backdrop of very marginal elections in Westminster City Council, which surrounds Oxford Street and historically has looked after the patch. And so it was a slightly bizarre board meeting where Adam Hugg, the leader of Westminster City Council at the moment, Labour leader, sits on the board of the new Oxford Street Development Corporation. You then had sort of saying, look, we wish this wasn't a thing, but it's here and we've got to take part in it. But Jeff Barraclough, who is the cabinet member responsible for planning and development, addressed the board and said, effectively, we don't see the need for this to take any planning control. It's fundamentally anti-democratic and we should oppose it. So a bit of Labour on Labour action taking place against the backdrop of elections in 2 months. So it's all coming along, and from a planning point of view and a decision making in Westminster point of view, this will create a huge amount of stability that, as you say, Kevin, sits completely outside of the election cycle. But everything around it is affected by this huge set of marginal elections that's going on. Against Labour feeling pretty vulnerable nationally, facing a threat from the left in London to the Greens, and really a gift from the Mayor of London and the government to the local Conservative team, who are the closest opposition party to Labour in Westminster, saying, well, look, this is something that shouldn't happen. And it's given them a great election campaigning tool for the next couple of months. So it's very much framing the debate in this part of Westminster and what that means for the future electoral governance of Westminster City Council is definitely going to be shaped by it.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Of course, we take a step back. What this also means is Westminster might change control, but the immediate area around Oxford Street ultimately will be led by Labour policy at the mayoral level until 2028. So that's something to bear in mind for those operating in Westminster and hoping for a Conservative victory. It won't quite be all that simple in wiping Westminster of red control. Just a final comment on local government. Whilst we're here, many listeners who've been involved in London politics and the built environment will remember Sir Robin Wales, who was a very strong and forceful Labour mayor of Newham, who led a lot of the Docklands regeneration, was involved in the development around the Olympics, and was quite big figure in London Labour politics. Given a knighthood for his local government efforts. Today, he actually after leaving the Labour Party last month. It turns out he was pitch rolling to defect to Reform today to be director of local government. So kind of a bit of a very much a kind of inside the very small beltway of inner London story, but of interest, but significant for Reform in that they're still yet to land a current Labour politician of any note. And this was billed as being a kind of huge announcement for them. It's not quite really what they build it to be, and just shows that Reform are still able to take from the Conservative Party right up to the shadow cabinet level, but do not have that reach into current Labour politicians. That's one to watch.
We like to finish these with 3 things to take away this week, 3 pieces of advice. So, Kevin?
So I think the first is obviously all eyes on the Middle East, not just for what it means for those living in Iran and the Gulf and the wider region, but for the economic impact in the UK. What the situation is today is not going to be what it's going to be in a month, a week, or even a year. So we're going to have to take the short, medium term, long view.
And the second piece is that the 5-party landscape after Gorton and Denton is real, and it applies to the elections on May the 7th. Don't assume that Labour holds anything. Don't assume the Conservatives are the main opposition anywhere. Greens, Reform, Lib Dems, Independents, Conservatives, they're all competitive in different places, and navigating that is going to be key to your success.
And in the city of Westminster, a battleground of old school proportions between Labour and the Conservatives. Remember them? One place that will not change is Oxford Street. As always, if you need to get into the minutiae of local politics in the development sector and beyond in London, get in touch.
That's it from us. See you soon.